Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'll be showing you how I built this farmhouse style coffee table in the video. The table's about 4 feet long by 24 inches wide by 18 inches tall. I'll leave all the dimensions in the description. So started with setting up a stop block for the measurements on my chop saw and cut 4 of the legs out of the 4x4. Then I cut 4 pieces of the 2x4 for the side frame at roughly 17 inches. Then I cut 4 more pieces of 2x4 at about 24 inches, and these are for the X braces. Next I cut 4 2x8s at 48 inches, and that's for the coffee table top. Next I cut 3 2x8s at approximately 37 inches, and that is for the bottom shelf. Again, refer to the description for the exact measurements. We'll have a cutting list also. Next, I sanded down the cut pieces with a 100 grit sandpaper just to clean them up. Next, I got out my Kreg pocket hole jig and used the 17-inch 2x4s to put in the pocket holes on both sides of all 4 pieces. Then it was on to assembly for the first side section of the coffee table frame. So I glued and screwed the top piece, and then for the flush with the top of the 4x4s, the bottom rail I lifted up 1.5 inches off the complete bottom, so I used 1.5 inch piece of 2x4 as a spacer guide. And once I was happy with the location, clamped that up and screwed it in. Same thing for the other side piece of the frame. Glue and clamp, just making sure that that is flush with the top of the 4x4s. Here you can see how I'm using the 2x4 spacer for to locate the bottom rail of the frame. Clamped it up, screwed it in. Now onto the X brace. So I measured on the diagonal, and you don't want to start at the end of the tape measure because it won't be able to get an accurate measurement. So I started at the 3-inch mark and got my measurement and transferred that to the 24-inch 2x4. And then located the center with the combination square. And then you just want to line those marks up on the 2x4 that you have into the corner of the side frame here, like you can see here. Trace those marks. Bring that piece of the chop saw and cut along those lines that you marked. And you want to make sure you leave the pencil mark so you get a nice snug fit. Same thing for the other part of the X. If the frame is square, they should both be the same length, and they were. So again, started at the 3-inch mark and went out to, I think it was 23 5/8. So mark those lines for length, and then located the center. Then you just locate those marks, the inside of the frame, make your marks. Cut it out at the chop saw, and again, just make sure you leave those pencil marks so you get a snug fit. So I guess if you wanted to at this point, you could just leave them the way they are. It wouldn't look terrible. But I did a notch, half lap notch in either of the 2x4s, so it would just be a flat X. So just mark on both sides. And I'm just referencing which was the top and which was the bottom X. So then you set your saw at half the distance of the 2x4, so 3/4 of an inch. Made multiple passes within the lines that I marked. Just cleaning up the remainder with a chisel. Doing the same thing with the other side. Multiple passes and it'll chip out. You can also run the saw side to side once it's mostly cleaned out to clean it up. Glued and clamped the X. Put the X into the side frame. And then just checking with the combination square that it's in the center. And I pre-drilled and secured the X to the frame with, it was 2.5-inch construction screws. Might have been 3. I think it was 3-inch screws. Same thing, just checking that the X is in the center. And pre-drilled, and 3-inch screws again. I did not use glue, it's not structural, the X. And the screws will be plenty along with the snug fit to keep it secure. You do exactly the same thing on both sides, so you can see I've got the 2 finish end pieces. So here are the 2x8s, and I just made sure which sides I wanted to be at the top. Getting ready to use my table saw. I have another video on the making of this workbench, which I'll put a link to in this video up in the top right hand corner. It should appear. So I'm just taking off the edges of both sides to get a more of a finished appearance for the top. You don't have to do this. If you don't, it'll be more of a rustic top. Just make sure that the lumber you're using is straight, so when you join them up you don't have major gaps. And then I just ran the tops through the planer once. Again, you don't have to do this. You can just use, you just sand a little bit more to get it smooth, but this is just a faster, more efficient way to get them smooth and consistent, so they lined up nicely when I join them together. And just doing a little bit of sanding to clean things up with 100 grit sandpaper at this point. Okay, then it was time to join them together, so I'm using Doweling Jig. I'll leave a description or a link in the description for this tool. Does a nice job, and if you don't have money for a biscuit joiner, this is a great alternative. And I did another video with a farmhouse style kitchen table, harvest table, that I used that jig on to match up some very uneven old oak boards out of my dad's barn. And I'll leave a link to that as well if you'd like to watch that. I did not use pocket screws on the tabletop because I feel like the dowels are give you a stronger bond. So this is easy to use and gives you consistent results. And I put 5 dowels across, and you can see a piece of black tape on the drill bit, which is just a depth guide for me to get the right depth on the hole that I drill equal to the dowel length. Now it's time to assemble it all up, so gluing them together, putting the dowels in, you might be able to see me taking dowels out. I just did a dry test fit to make sure everything was good to go before I started gluing, and it was, so onto the assembly. Now it's time to clamp it up. You don't want to over tighten these just yet. Just get them snug. And then you want to use a straight edge across the tabletop to make sure it's not bowed as you tighten the other clamps that I just put on. So nothing straighter than a 4-foot level, so I use those on either end with some bench clamps. And once you get those up snug, then you can tighten the other clamps up a little bit more and you'll get a nice flat top. And then I added a pipe clamp down the middle at the end. Alright, let that set up overnight and back to more sanding just to get some of the glue squeeze out off the top. Still with 100 grit sandpaper. Alright, I put that aside and then it was time to assemble the bottom shelf. And I did not run these through the table saw to clean up the edges. I wanted more of a rustic look for the bottom shelf, but I did run them through the planer just once, or sorry, twice actually, just to get these cleaned up. And I'm just flipping them over, and I did use pocket holes for the shelf, as I didn't need to be so precise about having the top of the shelf in plane like I wanted the top of the table to be in plane. So just going to town with the pocket holes. And clamping it up. Lots of glue. Same thing, just snug those up. And I used levels again. When I put the levels on the bottom here, which is actually the top of the shelf, and I put the level on the bottom as you see it, which is the top of the shelf, so that the top would be in plane. That's the one thing I don't love about the pocket holes, is if you're dealing with lumber that's not the same width, it'll make the side that you drill the pocket screws into level, not the other side. So that's why I put the level on the bottom. So now I'll be attaching the shelf to those side frames of the table with pocket screws as well. So that's why I've got the assembled unit and putting in, I think I put 6 holes on each side. And you can see the spacer that I'm using just to keep it in plane as I move across the shelf with the pocket hole jig. I'll leave a description or a link in the description for the Kreg jig as well. It's a great tool. Alright, time for more assembly. So I'm cutting the stretcher, and well, I cut the stretcher and putting the pocket holes into that now, and just located the center of the side frame, lined it up, used the Kreg Clamp to make it flush, screw that side in, and the stretcher's the exact same length as the 2x8s for the shelf. Same thing on the other side. Glue the Kreg clamp, and I use the pipe clamp, and screwed it home. Alright, I put my clamps underneath, slid the shelf into just as a test fit, and it was good to go. So put some glue in, snugged up the clamps, made sure I was happy with the fit, used the combination square to make sure I was even on all the sides, tighten the clamps down some more, and then using the screws in the pocket holes to attach it to the frame. So with 6 aside and glue, very, very sturdy. The one nice thing about the pocket screws is they kind of act as a clamp, so as you've glued it, you don't have to let it sit overnight, whereas with the dowels you do, so you can keep on working. Alright, on to starting to finish the top. So I did some more sanding with 150 grit, and then on to 220 grit. And you can see some burn marks from the table saw on the end pieces, but those will disappear here in a minute. I did end up sanding the all 4 verticals. There you go, it's gone. And now it's time to square up the 2 ends of the table. So I used a framing square to get my line, and then was able to use my favorite new tool, the Track Saw. This tool is a total game changer. If you don't have one, which I didn't for the longest time, you don't have to use it. You can use a 4-foot level and a clamp, and just clamps and just a regular table saw. Did that for years. But the Track Saw is awesome. So you do the one side, then measure off that side to get your straight line on the other side, and it just cuts like butter. Alright, and then it was on to using a round over bit just to get a nice edge on the top. And again, if you don't have a router, you don't have to use that. You can just as easily round over the edges with sandpaper. You can start at 60 grit and work your way up to 200. Certainly done that before. Alright, then let's vacuum the top off. Then tack rag. And then since it is pine, a soft wood, they don't necessarily stain all that well, so it's I always like to use the pre-stain conditioner. It eliminates the blotchiness you can get when you're staining softer wood. And then the stain just goes on 10 times easier, smoother as well. So not much to applying the stain. You don't have to worry about putting too much on, because you apply it and then if there is excess, just wipe it off at the end with long passes with either a brush or a rag. There you can see now I'm just evening it out. Let that dry overnight, came back and put a second coat on. wiped off the excess. Then it was on to first coat of poly. So if you're using oil-based poly, which I like the amber tone it gives off versus the water-based. It obviously takes a bit longer to dry, but I prefer it. So if you do use the oil-based poly, you'll want to use a natural bristle brush or spray. I like to spray lacquer most of the time, but for the sake of this video, I decided I'd brush it on in case people out there watching don't have the tools that I do and want to build a table. So just long, even strokes. Don't overbrush it or else you'll get air into the finish. It'll just make for more sanding. So started with 150 grit, then 220 grit, sanded by hand, not a ton. Then vacuumed it clean, tack rag again, and then wiped it down with mineral spirits, paint thinner, and that evaporates very quickly. Just the cleaner you can get the surface between coats, the better. It just won't be any dust for you to sand. Alright, sorry about that. Mom called. She's doing great. And so where was I? So yep, just make sure everything is super clean in between coats after you've sanded. Just makes for a much nicer finish. And I did a satin poly 4 coats. Just make sure you don't sand after you stain. You only want to sand in between the coats of poly. So this little sprayer is awesome. It's I have 2 of them, one for water-based finishes, one for solvent-based, and the sprayer is under $100, and the finish is so good I spray kitchen cabinets with it. I'll leave a link in the description for this sprayer. But anyway, the frame I sanded, tack ragged, vacuumed, and then just put on a light coat of satin antique white. And it is latex water-based, so that raises the grain a little bit. So sanded after that first coat very lightly with 150 grit. Vacuumed, tack ragged, and then put on a heavy second coat. And again, if you don't have a sprayer, you can do it by hand. It's just a little bit tedious with the excess. Then I use the TableTop Fasteners to attach the top to the frame. And I'll leave a description, link in the description. I'll get that right one of these days. For those Z-style tabletop fasteners. And there's the finished product. Came out great. You can definitely build it. So as always, thanks for watching, and make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Helps me out. These videos take a lot to edit and put together, and your support helps me keep making these videos. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.